This is Stuart Weinstein from Legal Talk on January 31st. There's two important topics that we need to address on Legal Talk. One is the unemployment epidemic, and the other one is battered women. Well, we're dealing with battered women today, and we have three credible guests who are in the thick of it and will be able to offer some opinions as to how to address it and how to solve it. To my left, my right, depending on the camera angle, Mark Creedon, who's the Executive Director of Catholic Family Services Appeal Dufferin. I have Virginia Koehler, you tested me, I apologize, who is the manager of the Violence Against Women in Catholic Family Services of Toronto. And I have Shawn Saulnier, who is pretty much on the funding arm, who'll be able to talk about the funding area of battered women. Mr. Creedon, if you could give a bio of yourself, and where do you see battered women? Is it an epidemic at this point?
Sure. I worked for 12 years at Catholic Children's Aid, then I worked for about a year and a half at Halton Children's Aid, then I went to Catholic Community Services York Region for about 3 years, and the last 18, 19 years I've been at Catholic Family Services Appeal Dufferin. I wouldn't call it an epidemic if you mean epidemic in the sense of all of a sudden it's a new thing and it's suddenly mushrooming. This is something that's big. Probably, somewhere between 1 in 10, 1 in 4 people are affected by it. But this has been going on for millennia. What's different is since the late 1980s is people are starting to pay attention to it. People are starting to believe women, and they need to do so even more.
Virginia?
Well, I too, like Mark, started out at Catholic Children's Aid and put in 12 years there. Was out in Peel for about 10 years, both at Peel Children's Aid and then Peel Family Services. And for the past number of years, I've been with Catholic Family Services of Toronto managing the Violence Against Women program. I just want to say I started when I was 12, so this is how the years add up. And like what you said, Mark, it's not an epidemic. It's been around since the biblical times. Mm-hmm. It's just that we're paying attention to it, and we see what great impact it has on family life.
Mm-hmm. And Ms. Saulnier?
For me, I think that to narrow it down to battered women is maybe missing a larger conversation. I would prefer to put it under the banner of domestic violence within the context of families. Yeah. It's not just about men and women, and you can't extricate one from the other, in my view. I think if you do, there is a certain problem in the process of trying to deal with domestic violence, of almost kind of the guys are always the perpetrator and the women are the victim, and you bulldoze the guys off and then off the cliff, and we call the women. And I don't want to sound like I minimize the impact on women. I know it's tremendous, and the violence almost always hits women. So I understand that. But the solutions are what we're talking about today. Okay. And within the context of a solution environment, I think you need to really reference the whole family, the children, the fathers, the mothers, and boyfriends and girlfriends together. Mm-hmm. And within that context, I think we have a much better possibility of dealing with root issues, because they're slightly different. Causes end up, most of the time end up being somebody being hurt. But then, that solution tree that we want to talk about today, I think there are some things being done for the total family situation, or for men and women, and if we look at it together, I think we'll do better.
Okay, well, so Ms. Koehler, if you want to sort of initiate that, and sort of saying that not just battered women, what does it entail? What pieces is it including?
Well, one of the big things is the impact on kids. Mm-hmm. Okay, they're the most vulnerable, mm-hmm. and it's often the women that are caring for the kids. So they go together. And when we do work with Children's Aid, you can't tease out protecting the child without incorporating how do you protect the woman, and the two go together. And furthermore, we've come a long way from not only seeing it as a problem, but seeing as part of the solution is working with the dads. Because one of the ways we have of helping them is through their care for their kids, and touching them there and getting them to look at how do they become better dads. So that's kind of how I would tie them together.
So then, Mr. Creedon, when you talk about this whole concept of Dufferin Peel and this whole aspect of different services coordinated together, Can you tell us a bit about the services that do exist and how they relate to what Mr. Saulnier had said about the addressing of it?
Oh, sure. There are probably about 20 some odd organizations in Peel that directly or indirectly deal with domestic violence. But we have started a program called the Safe Center of Peel, which is part of a multi-service center, which is called the Honorable William G. Davis Center for Families. And the Safe Center of Peel has 8 partner agencies on site that are dealing with domestic violence exclusively, and another 8 that are off-site for which we have protocols. So the agencies that are on site would be Victim Services, which deal very closely with the police, India Rainbow, which is a settlement agency, Trillium Sexual Assault Center, our own agency, Catholic Family Services Peel Dufferin, Legal Aid and the legal clinics, and associated youth services, and Catholic Cross-Cultural Services, and Peel Children's Aid Society. They're all on site. In fact, Peel Children's Aid Society has a whole team that's devoted just to domestic violence. Then we have people like the police, and the Crown Attorney, and Victim Witness Assistance Program, and the two shelters, Salvation Army and Interim Place, are off-site, but are working on protocols with us.
Well, I guess we'll come back to Mr. Saulnier in a second, but then is the government funding and is the funding to address this problem, is it there?
There's funding. If you add up all the funding we get from the different different sectors of the government, it's about almost $1.8 million that we're getting. Is it enough? Is it even close to being enough? No, it's not. For example, we have a coordinator position for this innovative model, the Safe Center of Peel. We have no ongoing funding to pay for that coordinator except for some private sources which are going to run out in December. Peel itself has its own special problem, and that's because the population has increased so fast since 1980 that we are getting about 33 cents on the dollar on a per capita basis for our violence against women services compared to the provincial average.
Mm-hmm.
But is there a part of the provincial government that they cut first? Like, do you feel like you're second class when it comes to funding?
Well, I don't think anybody's got anything against Peel specifically.
Or violence against women?
Violence against women, I think, is very much a poor cousin. Mm-hmm. That health funding is much more solid. Educational funding is much more solid. I think the reason is because everybody feels they're going to eventually need the health system, and everybody's niece or nephew or son or granddaughter or somebody is going to need the education system, whereas people have this myth, this blindness to think that domestic violence is never going to touch their life.
So, Mr. Saulnier, how do you in the private sector augment or get people to fund public programs?
Well, I think there's a lot of empathy for the agenda, which may not have existed maybe even 10 years ago. However, I do think that governments here in Ontario have set tremendous examples for the world in terms of providing safe places for women as an option for issues related to, I mean, 15 or 20 years ago, there were only a handful of shelters. There's 550 shelters in Canada today, and growing. So
is that a good thing that they're growing?
Well, you know, look, I think last year there were probably 55 or 60,000 women that registered in a shelter in Canada, and somewhere around 55,000 children that were registered in a shelter in Canada. So we could be really, I mean, it's those terrible numbers. And we could talk about that as an agenda, or we could reference that, you know, like it's funny when I look at some of these agenda items. Sometimes it's you can get really depressed. You can go right down in the bowels of it all, and you can find all the problems, and then we'll run out of time to talk about some of the things that are happening.
Well, can I say something about that? Because this is something...
I'm going to let you talk about that in a moment. We're going to come back in a moment and focus on that further. Yep. This is Stuart Weinstein from Legal Talk, and we will see you in a couple of minutes. Hi, Stuart Weinstein. Welcome back to Legal Talk. I'm here with Mark Creedon, Virginia Koehler, and Shawn Saulnier, and we were talking about battered women, which we renamed violence against women and its subsets. So Virginia had some points that she wanted to say before the break.
I just wanted to say something about the shelter system. I didn't want it to sound like it's the answer to the problem, that there may be 550 shelters in Canada, but we've recently had, in the month of January, 3 women, we couldn't get into the shelters when they needed a safe place to go on an emergency basis. And part of that problem is there's a backing up from the housing situation. If the woman and her family can't get safe housing and affordable housing, then, and they can't get into a shelter, they stay in a very unsafe situation. And I don't know how it's correlated to, but there's been a number of women that have been attacked and killed in the month of January. That's very disturbing. So I just want to say that one of the solutions, or one of the things I hope we can look at, is how do we help have safe and affordable and decent housing. That seems to be a huge issue.
And I guess that sort of ties into you, Shawn, in terms of funding.
Oh, I really agree with that. And the issue of transitional housing, I mean, shelters are a temporary measure to then look into the community and to try and assist that individual in finding a safe next step. And there is, tremendous issue there. I'm not trying to minimize that problem by saying this idea. I guess I have the spidey sense that there isn't going to be a tremendous increase in funding over the next 3 to 5 years and a lot of social programming. So I think until such time as people on the ground, I've been a volunteer with ShelterNet for Abused Women for the last 3+ years or so, and we linked the 550 women shelters together in Canada, have for a dozen years, and we've tried to provide a technology solution for women's shelters. They're not really focused on that; it's not their core. But I have a little bit of perspective on women's shelters, but I'm still also I have a lot to learn, and but I can tell you this: if we don't, from a few thousand feet up, start looking at more creative ways to magnify the investments that are being made already, of which governments feel like they're doing a lot. Whether they're doing a sufficient amount, or we're not going to solve that at the moment. But I doubt that any government would feel badly if the community started looking at ways to take the investment in the shelters and not only use them as shelters, but as a catalyst for attracting more healing.
Shawn, can I just jump in there for a second? There's 2 really innovative things that are going on in the family services world with regard to this. One is walk-in clinics, and walk-in clinics deal with more than just than domestic violence. It's virtually anything that people have. But what Kitchener-Waterloo Family Services found out when they asked the question, where would you have gone if this walk-in clinic did not exist? 17% said the emergency department of a hospital. Another 8% said they would go to their general practitioner. And for the most part, not dealing with the core issue. If somebody's coming in there to a family service agency, they're going to deal with the domestic violence. If they go to the hospital, sometimes they will. Lots of times they'll just deal with the fact that they've got a stomach ache or a headache, or they'll come up with something. So you get a very expensive, very intrusive system in being totally ineffective.
And it sounds like from what you're saying is that violence against women doesn't happen at a certain income level.
No.
Oh,
No.
it's very indiscriminate, crosses races, education, socioeconomic, yeah.
Because you're unemployed, and it's usually a money issue. But when violence against women doesn't seem
it could aggravate things. If you're at an emotional, abusive family and then you lose your job and you're going to lose your house and everything, okay, that might be the match that finally sets it off and makes it get worse, but it's not going to be the cause of it. The other thing that I think is important is, in addition to the walk-in clinics, is the fact that when Shawn was talking about shelters, and for sure we need good shelter systems, because especially some of our most serious situations we're going to require it, but only about 17% of the women who are abused are ever going to walk into a shelter. Many others are going to go to settlement agencies or be picked up through the police or the school or come to a family service agency. And this is where we have organized the response whereby we can really help people never have to use the shelter, but stop the violence. Because that's what women want. They want the violence to stop.
I like, you know, I've looked at the model that you use, and I really applaud it, because I think that it has a very holistic approach to dealing with the entire family. You have some innovative programming that I believe that the courts provide as an option to some perpetrators, where they can say, well, look, you can go to jail, or you can attend this program for the next 6 months, and we'll try and help reintegrate you back in your family if in fact that's the right thing to do, if it's a safe thing to do. And 95% of the time it is the right thing to do, and it is a safe thing to do, and it works. However, it's not much part of the conversation. So a lot of the conversation is always on the most egregious, you know, which is, of course, we all want to stop somebody being killed if we can. But it's the challenge with it is that the massive problem is not that. The massive problem, there's an ability within the community already to try and help take care of itself a little bit better. And we've been able, I've seen a lot of results of, you know, I know you guys are putting together families at a rate of over 90%. Is that right? So what is it that you're doing that could be replicated in other places?
I wouldn't say that we're putting together families that where violence is together at the rate of 90%, but what we are at 90% is people feeling empowered, people stop the violence stopping, and in some cases people can get back together. But what we've seen, not only ourselves, but when San Diego first started the first Family Justice Center, and then Kitchener-Waterloo, now known as Mosaic Family Services, started, the things that they noticed when you get a number of organizations coming together to provide a sort of a wraparound service for domestic violence, the murder rate drops. Now, in Kitchener-Waterloo, it was a small number, so it's not statistically significant. It went from 3 to 0, but in San Diego, well, unfortunately, it was not a small number, and it was statistically significant. The recantation rate, and by that what I mean is if you have a woman that gets, you know, the police come in March, and he's sent to jail, and there's charges made, and it finally gets to court the next December. Not surprisingly, a lot of women sort of say, oh, well, I think the police officer misunderstood, because she had no help, she had no support in that time. But if you give the person support, you provide a wraparound service for the variety of agencies meeting different needs, because people don't just have one need. Yes, they got hurt by their intimate partner, and that's a huge need, but they may have multiple other needs. And if you can provide that for the person, you're going to really empower them. So that's the other thing, is empowerment goes up, engagement and counseling goes up, the degree of the injuries goes down. It just makes a lot of sense, and it's what Shawn is saying, it's a better use of the money. But I think what government forgets is they love this idea, but they don't want to pay for the ongoing coordination of it. So, for example, in this Safe Center of Peel, we've got something like 16 agencies that we've got to work with. Well, nobody's paying for the coordinator's salary in that. It just makes sense. You're getting so much better service, so much better outcomes, which ultimately is going to save the government tons of money. One
of the other issues that I think is really going to be dealt with is the diversity of Canada.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And the issues, you know, the shelters by a lot of women that are new Canadians. There's a real gosh, I'm going to be chopped up in mincemeat for some of my comments. Like, I love what's going on, but there's some gaps for women that have different backgrounds. They're scared of being isolated from their family. They don't want to lose their family. They don't want their husband to end up in jail. They don't want to wreck their family. They want the violence to stop. And somewhere in there, there needs to be some attention. And I know there is some attention in Toronto, and Brampton, and where you guys are. But these issues exist in smaller communities all over the country. I'll tell you, it's also another issue. I've spent time talking with 2 camps within the Native community, with our Aboriginal community. Some of them participate in our shelter system, and some of them don't. And some of them say to me, well, the issue of violence, we want the violence to stop, but we want to deal with it in our community because you have an option to move to somewhere else where our people don't. What happens to me if we move from my village to Toronto? I'm cut off from everything. And so the issues are different for our diverse communities, and it needs to be part of the conversation.
Absolutely.
And that goes back to the funding, because when you're dealing with, we have 57% of our clients that identified as being born outside of Canada. And when they come to us, they're dealing with immigration issues, language issues, value differences, how to acclimate into Canada. And so when you're working with that population, you have to deal with much more complex issues. It slows it down, and that costs money, and that's a resourcing issue. And that's something that isn't being responded to, I guess, by our funders.
While funding is being worked out, though, I think there are some attitude issues within the sector, right? Some sort of, there's sort of parochial attitudes, some really attitudes that I think if they could be opened up just a bit, with a little bit more openness on the community level, while we're trying to figure out how to pay for more coordinators and things, you know what? I think that there's a willingness today for other services in smaller communities to work together, but it just takes somebody to say, you know what? Let's do it. Let's put a committee together. Let's try and coordinate our services.
It takes leadership.
Some leader. Yeah.
It takes leadership, but the leadership takes time. And if you've got somebody that's working with 17 partner agencies and pulling them together and working out protocols and doing all that stuff, that means they're not doing something else, like say seeing clients on your waiting list. But I know Virginia and Toronto their agency has multiple languages that you have to serve for, and we do have a similar population in Peel. Just recruiting to make sure you've got people with these different languages takes more time and effort. And then, of course, in our own center, we've deliberately recruited to make sure India Rainbow is one of the organizations there, to make sure Catholic Cross Cultural Services and other settlement agencies there, because you're absolutely right. To ignore culture, to ignore language would be, foolish.
There's a new association.
I just want to say, the goal of today is a blueprint episode, because there's no question that it's a huge issue that's not going to get resolved. So if you could briefly, as a wrap-up, where are the 3 next episodes that Legal Talk does, and prevailing upon you to be one of the 3, the part of it, where is those 3 next episodes focused on? Specifically, where you would focus on solving a problem?
I think Sean's idea is right, talking about how funders can assist the existing agencies to work together in a way that's most effective.
Okay.
I would like to see what we've done with bullying and drinking and driving, and make woman abuse that kind of an issue, and with public awareness and public attitudes being dealt with in our church communities, doing more things to provide down grassroots support.
And Sean,
I'd like to see more discussion about the many successes and the incremental improvements that have been taking place to be shared with the community, so that there is a greater appetite, a belief that we can make a positive difference to help encourage governments, local, provincial, federal, and within community leadership to actually say, I guess there has been a lot of improvement. Let's keep at it. Let's keep focused. Let's start duplicating models that have been working. Let's not always feel like we have to reinvent everything. Let's start cookie cuttering some of the best ideas.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for all 3 of you. I had Mark Creedon, I had Virginia Koehler, and I had Shawn Saulnier, who were our guests today to talk about violence against women. We started as Battered Woman, but we've renamed it, which brings a whole lot of other pieces, and we've developed a blueprint for it. Like the unemployment epidemic, violence against women is not going to go away in one episode, but we prevail upon our 3 guests to be on a future episode of Legal Talk. In terms of viewership, in terms of sponsorship, in terms of advertisers, in terms of investors, as we build Legal Talk, you can get in touch with me on Twitter at WLegal, 416-224-0200, and legalall.info. If you have any other issues or concerns, if violence against women is an issue that's impacting you, we'd like to hear about you, and we certainly look forward to seeing you on a future episode of Legal Talk. Thank you once again to my 3 guests.
Sean, can I just put in one plug?
Please.
Right now we're missing the coordinator position for the Safe Center of Appeals. They didn't get lost, but we don't have someone there. This would be a great opportunity. We're looking ideally for someone with a master's degree in social work, work, someone that has a lot of violence against women experience, but we'd also take someone that doesn't have a master's degree in social work but has that commensurate experience in violence against women. And what they really have to be able to do is to really understand how to work with the partner agencies and do what Shawn's talking about, how to get the best out of wraparound services and ultimately show leadership. So it's a great career opportunity.
Oh, absolutely, and we'll be mentioning that again, and hopefully there'll be other positions that come up. So with two birds with one stone, we can show violence against women and get somebody a job. This is Stuart Weinstein, and thank you for watching Legal Talk. Coming up in a moment, we will be talking about the class action lawsuit in EI. And thank you again, Stuart Weinstein, and this is Legal Talk.